Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
And I'm Braden. And you don't need to be able to read technically to drive safely.
Yeah, I would agree with that because for the most part, it's shapes and colors that are directing traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And those are, it's a universal language or it's consistent across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like everywhere where you can drive, green means go, red means stop.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't make the excuse that, oh, I was in Quebec. You speak French. I didn't know the red light meant stop.
Yeah.
Because the
Uh,
red light or the green light or the yellow light doesn't speak like a language. It's a universal meaning.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And then generally just like the signs, they do sometimes have words on them, but it's the picture that is universal that matters more. Like a stop sign says stop, but you know what the red hexagon means. Um and Yeah, the one that I thought was interesting was the speed limits. As you just match the picture on the sign to the picture on your dashboard. Um, and then the only other one I guess that is it's helpful to read is the street signs. But for me personally, I don't know the roads, so I'm looking for landmarks anyway to get where I'm going. I don't read the signs
Oh,
at all
true. And I
most
guess
of
if
the
you didn't
time.
know where you were going, you would just punch in the GPS.
Yeah,
And then it just tells you turn, left in 300 meters. And you know that
that's true. That's
although it
true.
is pretty dicey just to drive and completely blindly follow the GPS and exactly what it tells you to do.
Well, that just reminds me of that Office episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, you knew where you're going with that. Yeah, well, because it says the road sign as well, and sometimes there's things that are real close together, and you don't want to be like staring at the GPS and like trying to like match that to the road, because like the picture on the GPS screen is helpful.
Yeah.
Um,
And the only thing I'm wondering about um, I guess this, I wanted to go back to the speed limit and the number because obviously you'd have to read the number. I'm pretty sure that the number on those signs, like it's universal that that's the speed limit, correct? Like I can't
yeah,
think of anywhere where they post a number on a road like that and it means something other than the maximum speed you're allowed to go.
not like a one number thing. Like the only other numbers I see is like distances to exits or
Mm-hmm.
distances to cities or exit number actually
Exit,
might get
yeah, exit
confusing.
numbers, yeah.
Exit numbers could get confusing. Um,
And then aren't speed limit signs? Don't they look a little different in like place to place? Like in
maybe I'm
Europe,
not.
don't they have isn't it a circular sign with like a red circle around it and then the numbers in the middle?
It is a circular sign, at least in the UK. I remember it being a circular sign.
Now, again, for
Um,
the most part,
it was
if
still
you
white
see
though.
yeah, if you see a white or yellow sign with very bold numbers on it, it probably means the speed limit.
Yeah. The only other thing that I'm thinking of now actually is in Canada we have the number and then underneath it says kilometers per hour,
I was just thinking that too.
which again you could remember that like the long word means kilometers or whatever, or the long word means big number and the short word means small number. Um, because you would need to recognize the difference between kilometers and miles essentially.
Yeah, and then that's the part where it could get tricky
Yeah.
because 50 is 50. I mean, I guess in in some cases you would know because 50 and 50, for example, or a hundred. Like if you were going 100 miles per hour versus 100 kilometers an hour, you would be flying by people,
Yeah,
and
so
you would
there's an
probably know you're like, like I might be going the wrong speed, but it doesn't change the fact that you are going way too quickly down that road.
Yeah. Well, and that maybe I feel like if you know how to handle a car you could do okay with just like following everyone else's lead on the road,
Yeah.
and like not having that much sense of the rules, but like common sense says if there's lines on the road, that's probably so people have their own area. I'm going to stay within the lines. And then, you can go with the speed of traffic regardless of the speed limit.
Yeah, I would agree for the most part that if you were not literate in terms of numbers and letters, that you, for the most part could safely drive around
Mm-hmm.
roads because signs are universal and colors and things like that are all pretty consistent and standard. So you would obviously not drive through a red light thinking where you were, red means go. Like that
Mm-hmm.
probably wouldn't happen. I do think it'd be a little tricky when you're in a country that uses um, a different uh, what's the word, like measurement, whether it was
Yeah.
metric or imperial, because then too, depending on the speedometer, like our speedometers have two numbers on them,
Mm,
but the primary or the larger one is the kilometers an hour,
yeah.
and then we have the miles an hour, much smaller.
Yeah.
So I assume if you, I've never driven an American car, but I assume if you were in an American car, maybe it only has miles per hour, or it's flipped where the miles an hour are the larger and the
Mm-hmm.
kilometers per hour are smaller. So then you could maybe get around the speed limit confusion
Mm-hmm.
by just going follow the big numbers. Like the little ones
Yeah.
don't matter.
Yeah.
And like you said, with the street signs, that might be a little bit tricky. Like, is this the exit I'm supposed to get off at? Is this,
Mm-hmm.
you're not sure, but again, you could use the GPS as a guide. I wouldn't say blindly follow the GPS, but you could,
Yeah.
when it says, oh, take the next exit on the highway, you just take the next exit on the highway. It doesn't matter what number or
Mm-hmm.
sign or anything like that is there. You have to trust the GPS. That's where you need to get off because otherwise you can't read.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you just I mean at that point you can just follow landmarks too. Like imagine imagine someone 60 years or older is giving you directions and you go north until you hit the gas station and then you turn west and you don't need to read to follow those. But yeah, and I would imagine someone who can't read would be self-aware enough if they're traveling to another country to determine which numbers they're supposed to be following before driving. But it was an interesting thought that I had a few weeks ago. It was like, you don't need this, but it seems so like at first thought, it seems problematic. Like
Yeah. And then the more you think about it, you're
everyone,
like, okay, you could maybe
yeah,
manage.
in yeah, at least in this country, I would say everyone learns to read before they learn to drive,
And,
which
and the
probably
other thing I
helps a
was
little
thinking
bit.
about was like, uh, I'm pretty sure like the warning lights or things like that are universal across the board too. So
I think so.
if there were some sort of lights that came on the car, like your wheel's not attached correctly, or your engine's about to explode, or something like that, that you would clearly know, you're like, okay, I should pull over and no longer drive the car because it's probably a safety hazard for me and potentially the other people around me if something on the car unexpectedly fails. But that often comes up as like a logo or a symbol, again, which I
Yeah,
presume is relatively universal
yeah,
across the board.
and even if it's not, like it's a picture that's supposed to indicate what it means. Like it's not some abstract symbol that you're supposed to like reference in manual. Like you
Yeah,
can
like an
reference the
exclamation
manual.
mark comes up and it's like it could be one of these 50 problems, but
Yeah,
something's wrong. And you're like, oh, well,
yeah,
which one is it?
but it's literally like, oh, tire picture means the tire, something's wrong with the tire.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and all of them generally mean go to the mechanic. Um, and the more severe ones, I believe, are usually red, and the less severe ones are usually yellow,
Yeah. So again,
which is
the
helpful too.
colors
Yeah.
kind of help you out.
Hmm. Um, so yeah,
But I do not recommend trying that. If you are illiterate,
yeah,
it, it,
yeah. yeah, at least have a literate person in the car with you.
Yeah, that can help you out with the words that are
Yeah,
on the signs and stuff.
that's good. But yeah, that's good that the lights and like the universality of it and the colors of the lights and the order of the lights is all helpful. And it's nice that the lights make it easier in this situation. We talked about last episode how using lights for drill selection and queuing and things like that is maybe, well, a lot more complicated and also less helpful.
Well, the lights and symbols are kind of cues.
They are in this situation
Like
with
something
very
comes up
relevant
and you and
information.
it transfers information to you that oh, even though it's just a red light, that means you have to stop. And then okay, that means I have to press the pedal on the left or the middle pedal if you're driving a manual.
Mhm.
And that will bring the car to a stop so that I can safely get the line. Like it is a cue, no
Mhm.
different than coaching when you deliver some sort of instruction or action or anything. And then the athlete or the client or the person you're working with is like, oh, I have to do this thing
Mhm.
as a result of that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and that yeah just leads nicely into part two of this series where we are focusing less on the learning. Obviously, we're building upon the learning that we talked about last time and focusing more on, um, I guess, the science behind what we do as coaches in literally giving the instruction, providing the focus, um, constructing drills, selecting drills, things like that. Um,
Yeah, this is more the application today that we're talking
yeah,
about.
yeah.
Like, how is this information usable
Hmm.
in some ways? It's great to have these research studies and you know a lot of a lot of that information came from people doing like relatively novel tasks,
Hmm.
right? Or tasks that were just made up for the purpose of research studies. And
Hmm.
we'll see a little bit of that today with the queuing and things like that. They're not necessarily like real world
Hmm.
relevant tasks. Some of them are just made up tasks for the sake of research, but then it's important that we can try to figure out how can we use that information in our setting or use the outcome of those studies in
Hmm.
our scenario.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, and so the first place that I think about these things is we talked about last time that learning is directly related to the amount of usable information, essentially. So if you're doing a task that is very, very easy, there's no information that's relevant to you because it's very, very easy. And if you're doing a task that is incredibly difficult, there's a lot of relevant information, but you can't use it because it's just too much to focus on, too much to interpret. So you're sort of using like the drill, if we're talking about drill selection, needs to match the skill of the athlete. Um, and you can use cueing and feedback as a way to um, either make certain information more relevant or more easy to interpret. I would like put a cue in that sort of category where you're focusing on this. So this information is going to be maybe a little bit more um, noticeable.
Yeah.
Um, and feedback is helping you interpret what you just experienced. So giving you again more feedback that can relate to the next trial, if you will. Um, but it matters how you do those things and when you do those things.
Mhm. Yeah, like the whole idea behind drill selection actually works really well with um, the challenge point theory. I don't know if you've heard of
I've
this.
heard of it. Yeah, I don't know the specifics of it.
Yeah, it was two. I think Guagnoli, I think, is an American researcher, and then Lee is a Canadian researcher from Ontario. So these two researchers kind of put together this theory called the challenge point theory, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's the drill or the task that you select for the learner has to match their skill level in order for them to obtain or actually get usable information. And it's exactly what you talked about. If you have a task that is too difficult for somebody, what effectively happens is it means there's too much information and they can't actually handle it all. So then you get overloaded. But if you give somebody a task that's very easy, they figured it out with no problems, and there wasn't actually anything to challenge their their ability to process that information. It was just they could have done it with very little attention. So it's an interesting concept that I haven't come up with a real concrete way of using it, but the general theme of you have to find a drill that works for the user, or in this case the athlete, the client that's learning a movement, and that's always based on the level of expertise, and to some extent comes down to how many mistakes are being made, or how many good versus bad or desirable versus undesirable repetitions you're having.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as things become more consistent, you can make things more challenging and things like that. But I guess if we're thinking about like a more of a concrete way to apply, like we know that regardless of what kind of a model you want to use, you need to find a drill that matches the experience of the athlete. Um, and I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of different things that contribute to sport performance or like movement efficiency and things like that. And so each athlete, I would think, would follow, generally speaking, the same sort of a curve or the same sort of progression through those skills. Um, but also recognizing that some might be further ahead on others and lagging behind, compared to what you would expect anyway. Um, and so I think maybe depending on your sport, and if you're a strength conditioning coach or a sport coach that spends a lot of time in one sport, then you would probably have some sort of an idea of what the what is the baseline fundamental for this skill, and you can build up through the ranks where like initially it's just like, can we do this movement at all at any speed? Can we hold this position isometrically, maybe, you know and then you're moving, and then you're doing it a little bit more dynamically, shifting base of support, and then you're adding speed, adding load, adding range of motion, whatever. And then you start to get into higher repetitions, and then you start to get into like perception things, and can we do this reactively and stuff like that. And you can select drills to emphasize or de-emphasize any attribute along the continuum, I would think, anyway. But you just have to be creative with that and have an awareness of like what specifically am I trying to accomplish with this drill, instead of like this hypothetical drill where like I run to the cone and then do a crossover and then finish a layup. That works on doing a crossover. So someone who's bad at crossovers should do that drill. That isn't necessarily specific enough. Do they lack the like the hand coordination, the foot coordination? Do they lack the perception, the recognizing that a crossover is the move that you should be doing in this situation? All of those things would influence like how you structure that drill, even if it's the same fundamental drill, where you do a crossover and then a layup kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's where like we touched on a little bit at the end of the last episode, where like the errors and the mistakes that you see are so important, because at the end of the day it's errors and screw ups that drive learning. And so if you're looking at the challenge point theory, if you give a task to somebody and let's say they do it 5 times and they nail it every single one of those times, that's probably a task that's too easy. And in this case, we're on that spectrum where you talked about of the individual isn't obtaining any information, not getting anything from it, because obviously if they can perform the repetition over and over and over and over again without any errors, they probably already know how to do that. And so maybe it's fine to do a couple of them to rehearse a movement or prep or do whatever, but they're not learning anything. And then on the flip side, if you give them something to do and they can't hit any of it, and every trial, every rep, every time they do that drill or that task, if it's done incorrectly, then that's probably a sign that we've overwhelmed the learner.
Mm-hmm.
And the athlete, the user, whoever is not capable of doing that task and they're not ready yet for potentially any of the reasons that you mentioned. And so we're probably trying to find that sweet spot of,
Mm-hmm.
okay, they did 4 repetitions, 2 or 3 of them were pretty good. One of them wasn't so great. Okay, so they're getting enough information that they're learning it, but they're still making some mistakes. So that means the process of learning and refining a pattern or an action is still
Mm-hmm.
happening, but it's not so deflating for the individual. Because if you do something and you just keep screwing it up over and over and over and over and over again, and you have no success with what you're doing, that's going to become pretty deflating. But if it's like, oh, I got it on this one, I didn't get it on that one, I got it on this one, I didn't get it on that one, you know that you're capable of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that challenge in theory should excite the learner or the athlete to keep trying to push. So I think we can look at the errors being made potentially as a guide for us as the coach or
Mm-hmm.
the facilitator to help that person along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in one of the books I read, I remember, I think like a 60 to 80% success rate, something like that, as being like a good target range. Um, I think you would allow some room at the beginning if it's like a completely new skill,
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely, you would.
to um, just because it kind of takes a few repetitions to get like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And once they know, and like if they've done it once, then you can say like, okay, if this is like a 60, 80% thing success rate, then that's probably a pretty good drill for them for now. And then once they get outside that zone, then you progress them, kind of a thing. Um, but yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. That you want to, yeah, hit that middle point for sure. Um, do you have any thoughts about um like just basic cueing, I guess? Like where do you start with that?
Well, yeah, obviously. So we've talked now about like drill selection.
Mm-hmm.
So that might arguably be like maybe the first step that you take. You have an idea of where the athlete or the client or the learner is at, and then you go, okay, I think they're at this skill level. Let me give them this drill to
Mm-hmm.
do and see how they figure it out. And then you're completely right. We kind of get into the cueing part now, where that individual is doing a task or doing a drill, and then we as the coach or the facilitator is now kind of providing them feedback or giving them hints or instruction. We're trying to help them along
Mm-hmm.
as they figure out that drill or that task. Um, and like just to start with cueing, like just as a definition, what is it? It's like a directive to change behavior,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
if we think about back to the loose definition of motor learning or learning, and it's creating a relatively permanent change, that kind of lines up that a cue or a directive or a cue is some sort of directive to try to change that behavior. So we're trying to give somebody information or a hint to move what they like, move the needle of what they do from this end to that end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason I like that definition, it came from one of the Gabriella Wolf papers, or maybe it came from Winkleman's book, or perhaps both. I don't know. But that idea that a cue is a directive that changes behavior is that directive can be anything. And it goes back to the intro. It could
Mm-hmm.
be verbal or a word. I could say something to you, like
Mm-hmm.
Braden, if I was trying to get you to learn something, I could say something to you. I could visually show you and like do the move and be like, oh, you're here. I want you here. And then
Mm-hmm.
I'm mimicking or showing the movement. I could give you a rhythm or a sound. Now you're getting an auditory cue. You could like physically put your hands on the person and be like, no, 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 you're here. I want you here. Or I
Mm-hmm.
want you in this position. And then they physically can feel like the feedback, or if you have them go through some sort of like constraint where, oh, I'm going to put this object here. Don't touch this object when you do that movement, or I want you to maintain contact with this as you do that movement. Now
Hmm.
they're getting haptic feedback. Cues can be so many different things that it's not just a verbal instruction, which is why I liked your intro so much, because we were talking about all the
Hmm.
different types of feedback that you can get.
Hmm.
And as a learner or an athlete in this case, your coach may give you feedback of any of those varieties.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I guess I really like that definition, that explanation of it, because in that sort of context, the what I would think of as a cue as being like a verbal, like I'm telling you to do something and then you try to do that. But cue with that definition, it's kind of synonymous with a drill. It's kind of synonymous with feedback. It's like everything. Every part of coaching is a cue, if you think about it like that. Um,
And even things that you don't think about, like your body language, just in
mhm.
response to how somebody does something, you might think you're not giving them feedback, but they could probably tell right away if you were impressed or less than impressed with what you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. It's if we go back to like how the brain sort of functions a little bit. Um, I remember reading that for most movements, like if you're playing a sport, this isn't always the case because a lot of what you do is reactive. But if you're not doing a reactive based movement, your brain kind of plans the action to some sort of extent. Like there's a planning loop uh, based off of what you've done before. What kind of a movement pattern are we going to do, taking into account, the goal or the focus or whatever that's going to influence slight modifications to the plan. Then you start performing the movement as you're doing it. The sensory feedback is adjusting the plan if the plan needs to be adjusted along the way. And then after you're done, you compare, the goal and then the pattern that we just ran because your nervous system knows what pattern it just did and like what synapses fired, muscle activation, joint angles, all those things. It knows, it has that map and is comparing, okay, this was the goal, this is what we did. Did we succeed or not? Oh, we succeeded. Okay, sweet. Let's go in that direction. No, we didn't succeed. Okay, we need to figure something out. And you can use your, I'll just say cues because I think most people, when they think of the word cue, they think of like an auditory instruction um, as a way to influence the plan. And then feedback is kind of augmenting that comparison between what you did and what the goal was. Um, and so giving them a little bit more awareness of what's happening. And I heard on a podcast a while ago from like a neuroscience type person that you can use your feedback and like if you draw attention to something that was successful, the like serotonin release in the brain is like a reward for that pattern and it reinforces that pattern. So you can like you as the coach applaud a successful um, pattern or repetition or whatever. Um, but getting them to draw attention to like, yeah, you did good, and like them kind of celebrating and rewarding themselves, I did good, kind of thing to like reinforce that and speed up that learning process to make draw more attention to that pattern and less attention to the ones that weren't as effective, kind of a thing.
Yeah. And that would line up with like attention is such a big part of learning, like where your
Mm-hmm.
focus is. And obviously with cueing, like there's, if we look at internal versus external cues,
Mm-hmm.
right? And internal cues where we focus more, as the word would suggest, internally on the body's movements and how we're performing something, versus external is more on the things around us, usually like the goal or the objective of the movement. So if I was thinking about jumping as high as I could, internally, I might be thinking about flexing my hips and my knees and things like that and loading up and then extending my hips and my knees in order to jump. But externally, I could be thinking about I'm trying to hit my head on the ceiling, or I'm trying to jump and reach
Hmm.
for something up there. So our focus of attention, are we focused on internally what we're doing, or are we focused externally on completing that goal? That that matters.
Hmm.
And research, yeah, there's positives and negatives to both. Um, internal cues are great descriptors. They describe actions and movements really well.
Hmm.
Um, but the research is heavily in favor of using external cues because it reduces the amount of attention
Hmm.
that you need on all kind of the ambient noise and things that don't matter, and you put your attention on completing the task and the goal
Hmm.
at hand, which is jumping as far as you could, or jumping as high as you could, or putting the ball in the net, or whatever. So it's not shocking to hear you talking about the feedback and then being like focusing on what you did well rather than what you did poorly
Hmm.
is a positive. So I think that's a good takeaway for anybody when you're thinking about cueing instruction and delivering things to people. Where are you drawing the attention to?
Hmm.
And it seems overwhelmingly in favor of draw attention to the good things they are doing. Because, like you said, you want to reinforce that behavior and draw attention to the overall goal. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to get them
Yeah, just
like to achieve
draw attention to what you want, essentially. You
and
know,
what matters.
to yeah, exactly. Like, um,
I don't care if you flex your knee 60 or 70 degrees if you standing long jump 20 centimeters longer. I care about the fact that you standing long jump 20 centimeters longer,
yeah,
or you
yeah,
did the movement correctly. And if you had to change a few degrees in a movement, I do not care.
yeah. Well, and
That's
then
your
that's
individual movement solution.
just like we talked about last time. The body is very good at self-organizing if we let it. And so you focus on the things that matter and you get out of your body's way, because if you think about extending your hips and knees and ankles forcefully so that you can do that broad jump, then A, that's a lot of different things to focus on. B, you're hoping that if you do these things well, you do the jump well. But why don't we skip that step? Tell your body to do the jump well, let your body figure out, because it's been, like we said this last time, it's been doing that your entire life. You are very, very new at this specific thing. And there's a million different ways, trillions and trillions and trillions of ways to solve any problem. So why do you think that you're going to figure out the best option?
Yeah. And I
You
have
know?
a note here. Again, I'm not sure if it lines up with what you talked about. I don't remember if it came from Winkleman's book or if it came from one of the research papers. Um, or it may have even come up in the conversation we had with Nav. But
Mm,
those were 2 long episodes, and I don't remember off the top of my head everything that we talked about because we
yeah,
talked about so much great stuff.
yeah.
But the idea of when you're delivering instruction or you're delivering feedback, talking about doing rather than not doing,
Mm,
which aligns with what you talked about, where draw attention to the things they're doing well. And I have a tough time with it. I catch myself all the time when I'm coaching, or I'll be like, oh, I don't want you to do this. And then I'm like, Tommy, you dummy. Like, pretend like you didn't say that. Tell them to do
mm,
what you want them to do. Like, I even did it just last night. I was in the weight room trying to get somebody to hip hinge. And I told them, I don't want you to bend your knees and have them come forward. And I was like, no, no, don't say that. Just tell them, I want you to keep your shins vertical or
mm,
relatively vertical as you push your hips back
mm,
or something like that. And I catch myself all the time saying, don't do this. And then I have to follow it up with, please do this,
mm.
when I'm trying very hard to get into the habit of just, this is what I'd like you to do. And
Yeah.
only drawing attention to that and not even putting the incorrect movement or pattern or undesired thing even out there for them to
Hmm.
think about. Like, I almost don't even want them to know that. Because, like you said, if we only have so much attention to give, I want you to give the
Hmm.
attention to things that matter. I catch myself doing that all the time, though. I don't know about you, but it was an
Yeah.
interesting point that I had here, and it lined up with what you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that as much like, I mean, I know that I do that for sure. And I find it to be a little bit helpful sometimes. Like if you're teaching it for the first time, then you want to say um, like I always just talk about the positions and then do a demonstration, like the positions that I want, do a demonstration, um, and then like provide the main focus kind of a thing. And if someone does it and does it wrong, then I'll say like, okay, here's like again, this is the positions I want, this is the focus. I don't want this. This is kind of what you did. And I so this is the difference between what you did and what I'm looking for, kind of a thing. So it's so tough to like because we've been coaching for a long time to get out of to get out of habits and be like there's just one way is better for them to hear and easier for them to learn and the other way is easier for us to say and easier for us to
Yeah.
you know what I mean for us to like we want to convey our information as much as possible but it's easier just to get the information out if you get that distinction. And it's the same with like providing an external focus of attention and like a thought out like metaphor analogy or like focus
Yeah.
to direct towards is a lot. It takes more effort, I think, on our part than just purely describing the movements we want to see.
Yeah. I try to justify that don't and do the same way that, um, the positives and negatives of the internal versus external cueing, and that no, internal cueing is not bad, but it describes the movement really well. So you have some coaches who will give the internal cues, they'll describe the movement or the action,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'll finish it off with the external cue or the goal of what you're trying to achieve. So then, like with recency effect, the last thing the athlete has heard or is thinking about is that overall goal or action that you've given them to achieve, but you still found a way to get that internal information or that movement description within it, but you just made sure that wasn't the last piece of information that they were hearing. So
Mm-hmm.
part of me justifies that, oh, I don't want you to do this. Instead, I want you to do the following. And I go, oh, well, recency effect. I finished off with the thing that like I want them to do, but I brought attention to the
Mm-hmm.
thing that they were doing that was undesired. But I still every time the words, oh, don't do this comes out of my mouth. I'm like, oh, you dummy. Don't say that. Just
Yeah.
bring attention to the things that you want them to do. So again, I don't know if it's good or bad. I honestly can't really compare that well because I catch myself every time saying,
Mm.
don't do the following, do the following. And I'm not at the point where I can consistently, I don't know if I've ever run a session where I haven't said, don't do the following.
Mm.
And I can compare like, oh, I only talked about doing certain things and it actually helped because it's just so ingrained in me. I can't get it out.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So
you're a good coach. You've taught a lot of people, and like it clearly what you're doing is at the very least fine. You know, like I wouldn't. Like, we want to get better, obviously, but I wouldn't
yeah,
beat yourself up too much if you're doing a good job.
no, but I catch
Um,
myself every time. So I know I'm like,
yeah.
oh, I gotta, you
But
know,
like I like in Winkleman's book, there's that sort of like kind of like the feedback sandwich thing. It's he has a sandwich metaphor or whatever,
yeah,
where you start with demonstration plus the internal description of the movement because and I think this is more important for I guess maybe this part of our conversation is like teaching something for the first time or the first few sessions anyway.
yeah. That
Um,
that's a very good point because it does matter if you're teaching something for the first time or you're coming back to something you've done
yeah.
numerous times.
So is if we're talking about the hip hinge or the RDL or whatever, if I just say, okay, uh, grab the bar and reach your butt back, they're like, what? That doesn't mean anything to me. So, okay, sorry. I will show you. I will pick up the bar. I want to start with my chest relatively upright, small bend in the knees. I'm going to shift my butt back, trying to maintain that like hip spine position. Okay, this is the goal of the movement, and I will show you a few times. So now, with that information in mind, I want you to focus on touching your butt to the wall, and then you watch them do it. So you've got your demonstration, internal feedback, or sorry, internal description,
Yeah, the information for them.
The external focus of attention, the cue, watch them do the movement, and then after the movement, um, I can't remember actually. There's somewhere in there where he wants the athlete's feedback and then he gives his own feedback. Probably athlete feedback and then his own feedback.
I would
I
think,
think
but
that,
I only say that because I usually finish it off with then once they've done, I'd be like, hey, what did you feel on that?
yeah,
And then I
which I think makes
follow
sense.
their response with, okay, this is what I
Yeah,
saw, so it lines up or doesn't line up for the following reasons.
yeah, because as soon as you give your own feedback, that's going to skew their opinion of what they just did anyway. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and I think that's a really good model to follow, generally speaking, most of the time. You want, because if their feelings, like if you saw something and what they describe doesn't match with what you saw, then
There's
a
a
real
disconnect.
conversation needs to happen.
Yeah.
But if what you saw matches what they felt, then okay, perfect. We're off to the races. Or exactly what you need to work on, kind of a thing.
Yeah. And it helps identify for you. And that's where then, you can get into the internal, the external cues, like what are you going to give them? Um, we didn't really, you briefly touched on like metaphors or comparisons as well,
I
which,
love I
which
love
I
analogies.
consider to be a type of cue,
Hmm.
like an analogy. You're drawing a comparison from one thing to another. And oftentimes when we're working with athletes, it's comparing it to something in their sport because they often have spent more time in their sport than they have you know, in a weight room or doing other types of training and things like that, right? So it's very easy to draw a comparison to that. Or if
Helps
you're
with
working with a
buy-in.
client, yeah, you compare it to like their career, the job they do, or
Hmm.
something that you know. But I'm a big fan of using stories or analogies or some sort of metaphor to bridge the gap between that undesired and desired movement and give the
Yeah,
learner the information, hopefully, that they need to complete that movement well.
yeah, absolutely. That's, yeah, one of my favorite things. The the other one that I this is the one that feel it's really kind of easy to do, I think, but this is the one I struggle the most with is um so in Gabriella Wolf's research and in Winkleman's book, because he talks about Wolf's research a lot. Um,
Gabriella Wolf is kind of
yeah.
you know, the the peak of the mountain when it comes to feedback, internal, external cues,
Hmm.
research. Like that is the person you want to go to for that. So it's no shock that her work is littered in Winkleman's
Yeah.
book.
Um, so I'm reminded of like a lot of her first studies were on like that ski
Yeah, the
switch,
ski
like
balance board
slide board
switching.
machine
Yeah.
thing. I don't know, like I don't actually think I've seen pictures of it, but like imagine kind of like a skateboard on tracks kind of a thing.
I'm
Um,
envisioning like, when you went to those like immersive arcades
yeah,
and you could play like the ski game or the
yeah.
snowboard game and you actually like
You
stood
do the
on.
slalom kind of thing,
Yeah, I'm envisioning it's some
something
sort of
like that.
device like that. Maybe that's just my imagination. I'm like,
Yeah,
that would be cool if that's how they were doing the study, but
no,
that's what I always
something
envision.
something like that. And I can't remember, like there was a lot of trials involving this kind of a machine, like a lot
Yeah.
of different experiments and stuff with, and they're measuring different things, and different things mean success in these different experiments. So I can't remember exactly what um, specific things they were looking at, but it's generally speaking a balance related task. Um, and focusing on foot position was consistently, or where your feet were was consistently worse than focusing on the position of the board. Um, and
Again, sort of
then
that internal versus external cue.
exactly. And so there was thought about, like, is it the distance away from the body that matters or whatever? So anyway, they put stickers, or there was like stripes or whatever on the board, literally like a centimeter or a millimeter in front of the foot. It's like, okay, you're going to focus on where your foot is, or you're going to focus on this sticker, which is basically in the same spot.
Yeah.
But focusing on the position of the stickers was consistently better than focusing on the position of the feet. And using that information, Winkleman talks about if you need to cue specific joint angles or joint movements, positions, whatever, like if we're talking about a broad jump, you can easily think about like, okay, launch forward towards the cone, or launch, forward towards the end of the sand pit or whatever. Um, and that gives you a very easy focus of attention that influences the entire movement, right? But if we're talking about, I don't know, somebody that has a hard time with hip extension specifically, and they're very good at extending the knees and the ankles, but not the hips, maybe you want to focus on extending the hips specifically in the jump. Um, and for that person, focusing on extending the hips specifically is an internal cue. So instead, you could think about like shoot your belt buckle forward or whatever. I use belt buckle for hips all the time. I use like the logo on the chest for like sternum position all the time. And those ones are easy, but it feels very silly sometimes to like, if you're doing a row, for example, to like imagine there's a sticker on your elbow and you're trying to touch the sticker to the ceiling. That sounds like that's way more words than saying pull your elbow higher, and
But it works
it does
for the most
work.
part.
It does work. I mean, we'll get into this more in the next episode, but I find a lot of the time people are so used to hearing internal cues that that's what they want. I've found that a lot, honestly. Um, but we'll get into that next time a little bit more.
But I mean,
But
it does depend on the learner
it does.
too, which I think
It
is an
does.
important part. And again, internal cues are not bad or good. External cues are not bad or good. Analogies or metaphors are not bad or good. Like they all bring certain benefits to the table.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And depending on the learner, depending on the person, you're going to have more or less success with different types of cues. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and if you only use internal cues, you might overwhelm a novice learner who doesn't know that much about stuff. But for a very high level learner, that might be the precise information they need to make a change on
Mm-hmm.
reps that they're doing. The same way an external cue might not give the specific information the expert needs, but it helps the novice who doesn't have a lot of experience just focus on the overall goal at
Mm-hmm.
hand. A metaphor or analogy could be great, but if it takes you 30 minutes to deliver, like, oh, I'm going to tell you a story, and the
Mm-hmm.
next thing you know, 10 minutes has gone by, well, you've missed out on 10 minutes worth of repetitions and practice that you could have
Yeah.
done. So I think they all bring positives and negatives. And part of coaching and working with people that there's no real like right or wrong answer is we get better at working with individuals over time because we get to know them. And if I put an
Mm-hmm.
athlete in front of you that you don't know right now and have you coach them, you might find some things that work and some things that don't work.
Mm-hmm.
You might have a bit of your default like go-to strategy, and then you might realize, oh, this and this thing didn't work. But then as you get to know the person, you're like, oh, auditory cues work really well for them, or visual cues work really well for them, or they respond well internally or externally. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's not everyone is going to fit in the perfect like research shoebox that's
Mm-hmm.
been created. So I think there's value in all of those things, right? And
Yeah.
and I don't have a right answer for this is what you should do with people, because you're probably going to coach people very differently based on how they respond. If somebody responds well to a visual cue, I'm not going to try to put the circle peg in the square hole and be like, no, no, no. They respond well to visual stuff, but I'm giving them auditory things because
Yeah.
too bad. That's how I do it.
Mm-hmm.
No, I might give one person a visual cue and the next person an auditory cue, and they might be making the exact same error.
Mm-hmm.
But I know one is going to respond well to this and one is going to respond well to that. So that's, I think, where some of the mystery is you can pick the perfect drills, you can have all the cueing information and everything ready, but you never know how the learner is going to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And it comes back to, a pretty common thing we've talked about in a lot of episodes where the more cues, the more tools you have in the toolbox, that allows you to better adapt to the people in front of you. In this case, the
Mm-hmm.
athletes, the learners, whoever it is you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
If you only have external auditory cues, Well, you're going to work fine with some people, but people who don't respond well to that, you're kind of toast. So
Yeah.
if you have a number of different drills to select from, if you have a number of different big bank or inventory of cues and internal, external, all different types, you're probably going to be more successful trying to find the right tool for the job in terms of helping that learner get through something.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the more you work with somebody too, um, the more you kind of like you learn what kind of cues they respond to, and as they progress, you develop sort of a shorthand. So the first time you teach a movement, we talked about you do the full description demonstration, um, give them their focus, watch, feedback, right? And then over time, like maybe the next time you do it, you do the same demonstration, but it's a little bit shorter, a little bit less words to say, and then the same cue, and then the next time it's um, maybe yeah, even shorter, and then the next time maybe there is no demonstration, and then the next time you start to shorten the cue so that the if the cue is less words but means the same thing, then it's taking up less attention, less time, more repetitions, and then you get further and further away from that. And then eventually that cue is just ingrained and then you can start focusing on other things.
Yeah. Yeah. You've done a good job when someone does something and then they look at you and they go, I did this, this, and that, didn't I?
Mm,
And you're like, oh, you did. But again, errors drive learning, mistakes drive learning.
hmm.
So if someone can detect the fact that, like, oh yeah, it didn't feel good because I did it this way instead of that way. Like that's what we want as coaches and as people who are
Hmm.
trying to facilitate learning. We want them to be able to pick
And
up
hmm.
on those things, and that's a huge sign, I think, of success that you've been able to effectively move information from you to them.
Hmm.
That once
Yeah.
they know what's going on, now okay, we've probably hit that point where once we figure it out, moving on to the next thing because you know what you're doing with this now.
Yeah. And that's part of the feedback too, like drawing when something is good, drawing attention to it. When something is not as good, drawing attention to it just for the fact of like notice these differences, right? Between what a good rep feels like and what a bad rep feels like.
Yeah,
And then over time they can start to sense like, oh, okay, I've experienced this sensation. That means I probably did this. Yes, that's correct. And then they can self-correct instead of me having to correct them, and then it becomes um, a more refined pattern that way. And that's another big part of the transition is like initially in their journey, feedback is very very important and should be given quite regularly because they have no reference for what's going on. So they need to be told, is this good or is this not good? Um, but over time, you want to be giving less and less and less feedback so that they are kind of going along their own journey, and letting the drills maybe give more feedback than you are giving,
exactly.
you know. Um, and I mean, I guess we should dig into that a little bit more as well. The different effects that drills can have, different drill selections. Um, and it seems intuitive for to constrain a drill in a way to encourage the proper execution or to give information when the proper execution is not done, um, to make it easier to do the proper execution. But I find it very fascinating, and I haven't had the courage, I think, to actually play around with this much. But constructing a drill to encourage the incorrect execution so that somebody knows how bad that feels and that they self-correct. There is research. I think Winkleman talks about it in his book. Um, of I think it was Winkleman's book. It might have been a different one that I read, but there was something with uh, speed skaters, I think, and if they're not doing their crossover step properly, then the toe of the skate digs into the ice and then they fall, which makes a lot of sense. Um,
And it's
so
obviously not what you want as a
it's not
speed
what you want.
skater.
So then you were they gave cues to like basically make that happen more often. And so then, the learner is experiencing more and more failure. So then they start self correcting away from it. And then that ended up being even more effective than a good cue
Mhm.
to encourage the proper pattern. And there's been the same sort of studies with golf as well. Those are the only two sports I remember reading about, but it was very interesting. You have to be intelligent with how you do it. I'll probably try to make sure I find that stuff more specifically for the next one. But yeah, very interesting.
I mean, at the end of the day, it lines up with the theory that mistakes and errors drive learning.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to be careful with it. A, is it something that's potentially unsafe?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to obviously limit the risk. And then two, you don't want to like completely deflate the learner to the point where everything is like not being done well and they lose confidence. But it's an interesting, excuse me, interesting concept. And I've never intentionally tried to get people to do things wrong, but I've become more willing over the years to let people like dabble or kind of move in like a less desired way.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not so quick anymore. Someone picks up a bar, picks up a weight or does a drill or does a movement. And if it's all wrong, like I will let them go through it a few times.
Yeah, you do a few.
Yeah. And start to see like, okay, are they figuring out is excuse me, is this actually, what they're doing? Are they making any changes? And again, it gives, like you said, it gives a reference point to kind of like a poor movement of like, no, I don't want to be here. And they have a feeling of, you know, incorrect foot position landing on the ground or a rounded spine when you're pulling something or things like that. But obviously I've never played around with like intentionally trying to put somebody in that position.
Mm-hmm.
I've just been willing to let somebody, okay, I'm going to let them do that set in that way. And then they start to do it again. And then I might let them do a rep. I'll go back to the RDL because that was, some stuff that we were doing yesterday. And, oftentimes you see a lot of people kind of squatting it
Mm-hmm.
or the bar gets like way far away from the body
Mm-hmm.
and they're just holding the bar in a different area code. And like that's a great way to damage your spine. And so I might say, okay, I want you to do this rep and then pause at the bottom. And then I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you feel where you are? Okay, now I want you to like push your knees back. I want you to bring the bar closer. And they're like, and then I'm like, now do you feel this? And they go, yeah. I'm like, does that feel different? They go, yeah. I'm like, okay, come back up. I was like, if you feel it in your low back, probably means the bar is getting away from us.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel it in your quads, it probably means you're bending your legs. If you feel it in the hamstring and the hip, that probably means you did a good job of driving
Mm-hmm.
the butt back. So you can, I guess I've done that a little bit without actually hearing this, but I've never intentionally put somebody in a bad spot to be able to draw the comparison. I've just call it by chance been able to compare good versus
Mm-hmm.
bad because somebody does it poorly, like
Mm-hmm.
unknowingly. They're just doing it the way that they know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Again, yeah, it would be something I'm a little nervous to
Yeah.
play around with, like to intentionally put them in a wrong position. But
Yeah, it would have to be the specific kind of a skill. I feel like safety is important, as you
yeah,
say, So I'll find that research for the next one for sure. And
but I think there
um
is value in people doing things wrong because that
mhm,
drives learning.
yeah,
I think I'm
absolutely.
more just willing to take it organically as it comes with the reps that they're doing rather than trying to like encourage them to be in the wrong spot and then be like, oh, you see how this feels? It feels crappy.
Yeah.
Don't do
Well,
that.
and because you'll see, like you show them how to do something and then you give them the cue and then they go through a few repetitions and sometimes the first one is terrible and then the rest, get better. It's like, oh, okay, nice. You're going in the right direction. It's perfect. If you stop them after one, you don't know if that's going to be the case.
Yeah,
Um, and then you give another demonstration, explain a little bit more, give them a different cue, and then you let them go a little bit and it's better. And then you let them go a little more and it's oh, okay, it's better. And then you're like, yeah, that one was nice. That one was nice. Keep doing that. Do that again. That's perfect. And then now you're starting to build upon it. And I guess what you described with that like pause at the bottom of a bad RDL kind of thing, it to me is something like a pause or something like taking away stability or whatever. Like it's things that make it obvious that you're doing it wrong
Yeah.
is that I guess is for me anyway, maybe the sweet spot um, or one of the sweet spots, you could say. I
Yeah, I
don't,
feel like you get a little bit of that without like the potentially high risk
yeah,
of just
exactly.
intentionally throwing somebody in the wrong spot.
Exactly. So, when if you see someone who's doing something and like they're very clearly off balance, but they don't feel that, then making them go really slow,
Yeah.
then like, oh, okay, I'm going to fall over if I keep going the way I was, stuff like that. Or there was another one in a book that I read from another one about movement. It was baseball pitchers, and so if
Mhm.
they don't have a proper foot plant or a proper hip rotation, something like that, um, then you'll see them kind of like like if they're a right-handed pitcher, fall forward and off to the left of the mound, kind of thing, because that's where their momentum is going. They're not like
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
stable on their landing. So then having pitchers instead of pitching on the mound, pitching in sand, or at least their front foot is landing in sand. So it's a lot less stable and that they'll just fall right away if they do it wrong, you know?
Oh, true.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And you would say, like, this is the case. So start slow. I don't want you to fall right away. But then if you can build up to the same, pitching speed, the same footwork, but staying upright in sand, then you're going to be so much better off when you go back to the mound, you know, stuff like that. Anyway, where you're drawing attention to the flaw in your movement and letting the body self-organize to overcome this new problem, if you will.
Yeah. You're using the environment or the external things around them
Yeah.
to highlight that as opposed to just like telling them something.
Yeah. Because that only goes so far, especially with a movement that is so explosive, like a
And
pitch.
complex and sequencing and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting anyway. Is there anything else that you think we should talk about before the next one?
Not for me. We're kind of touching on a whole bunch of things now. Like we're like, flirting on the edge of things that I think I'm excited to get into for the last part. But some of the application and how we actually like we theoretically talked about some things you can do, but like getting
Yeah.
into the real nitty gritty of like
Man,
what
there's
does
so
this look
much.
like in a coaching session or in a practice or something like that.
Yeah. 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 There's so much to get into. My goodness. Okay.
Yeah, there's
Next
it's
episode's gonna be fun.
oh yeah,
Next episode's
there's
gonna be dense.
yes, yeah, and probably constantly drawing back on like in part two we talked about whatever,
Yeah.
or part one we talked about this and trying to like bring the whole thing together collectively.
hmm Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Um, so until then, I guess we're going to occupy a little bit more of your attention to talk about music that we've been listening to recently.
We always do.
Always
And
do.
this is a shorter turnaround than usual for you.
Yeah.
This is the first weekly music turnaround for you, and
It's been a little
it's
while.
been a while. Yeah,
So I do have something today, but we're gonna be hard pressed in the future. So try to figure it
I'm trying to. Yeah,
out. I guess the best ones that I have. So I mentioned podcasts that I was listening to
yeah.
last time. I've started listening to the Pinnacle Performance podcast more recently,
Okay.
which is very, very good. Connor Harris does a lot of stuff on Instagram and YouTube lately, which I've found his stuff to be quite interesting. And he's the host of the podcast, so it's been a lot of fun to listen to. But in the more musical area, that same podcast that I mentioned last time, Dungeons and Daddies, has like each season has a different intro song to it,
Oh,
and
true. Okay.
all of the intro songs are fantastic.
Are they originals or are they taking them from?
They are originals.
Okay.
Originals. Maxton Waller is the guy that does all their intro themes, and I don't know who that is. Maybe he's a fan of the show or has like a SoundCloud or something. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, they're all very, very good, and yeah, it's just like way too good to be in front of something as silly as what I described last time.
I mean, that's all
You know,
right.
no, it's good. It's
Yeah.
great. It's great. So anyway, yeah, that's what I've been listening to. How about you, Thomas?
Yeah, I've been back on the synthwave train.
Nice.
Um, the drive to work. So I got to find something to listen to. Um, so yeah, listen to a little bit of like Sunset Neon.
Sounds cool.
There, I don't know if it's one person or if it's like a duo or a trio. You never know with these synthwave groups. Um, so much of it's like electronic, so you could just I'll lay down the piano and then I'll lay down this and then I'll sing over top and then I just put the whole thing together and boom, it's a solo project versus like actually having members. But no, Sunset Neon, they got like a real like high energy kind of like 80s vibe, which obviously is a lot of synthwave, but they have a cover of some like Michael Jackson stuff
Mm,
from the 80s. And even some of the songs that they have that are originals, you can tell that it's influenced by that.
mm,
So they got some interesting kind of high energy, like 80s sounding, but like a little bit of like 80s Michael Jackson influence
mm.
into the sound. So it's an interesting like combination. And so far every song that I've listened to by them has been like super catchy, super good. I
Nice.
have to keep hitting the repeat button. I'm like, yo, play it again, play it again, play it
Yeah,
again. Let's go.
that's where you want
Um,
to be.
so yeah, definitely like good stuff. It's upbeat, it's high energy, and um, yeah. So I mean, if you're looking for something that's maybe a little poppier or catchier,
Mhm.
that's a good way you could go.
Right on. Right on.
Excuse me,
Um, yeah,
I'm losing my
hopefully,
voice here.
yeah, hopefully Tommy's throat will be better adapted next time
It's
to
been 2.5 weeks of losing my voice.
the career change. Um, yeah, no, that was a lot of fun. I'm super looking forward to the next one. If anybody listening to this wants us to talk about anything specific, different questions, concerns, comments, hit us up on in the comments on Instagram or YouTube, or you can message us at Braden Southern on Instagram, Speed Strength Performance for Tommy on Instagram, and Speed Strength Show for the show on Instagram. Um, yeah, and until then, that was the Speed Strength Show. Thanks for coming along, world.
We'll see you next time.
Peace.